true control is silent. While the crowd chases logic, power moves through timeless fears. This is Power Ledger.
Ladies and gentlemen, smart people don't lose money because they lack intelligence. They lose it because intelligence creates confidence. And confidence, when left unchecked, quietly destroys judgment. Ladies and gentlemen, history is not written by the foolish. It is written by brilliant minds who believed they were in control, right until the moment they weren't. Power does not collapse loudly. It erodes silently through certainty, pride, and delayed fear. Ladies and gentlemen, intelligence has always been a double-edged weapon. It sharpens perception, and then convinces the mind it cannot be wrong. Every fallen empire was managed by educated men, strategists, thinkers, advisors. None of them believed failure applied to them. They didn't ignore danger. They reinterpreted it. Ladies and gentlemen, markets behave the same way, not because numbers change, but because human behavior repeats. The more you understand, the more you believe you can manage risk, the more confident you become, the more invisible your blind spots grow. And that is where loss begins. Intelligence is commonly treated as protection. From an early age, smart people are taught that understanding reduces risk, that knowledge creates safety, and that the ability to analyze a situation guarantees better outcomes. Over time, this belief hardens into identity. Intelligence stops being a tool and becomes a shield. This is where the danger begins. Intelligence does not eliminate error. It changes the way error forms. When someone is aware of their ignorance, they move cautiously. They ask questions. They hesitate. Fear remains visible. But when someone is intelligent, fear does not disappear. It mutates. It hides behind logic. It dresses itself as confidence. The mind begins to believe that because it understands the system, it can control the outcome. This belief feels rational, it feels earned, and it is almost always wrong. History repeatedly shows that the most catastrophic failures were not caused by stupidity. They were caused by certainty. Empires were not governed by fools. They were managed by educated elites, advisors with deep knowledge of politics, warfare, and economics. Their downfall rarely came from ignorance of threats. It came from the belief that threats could be managed later. Intelligence allowed them to reinterpret danger instead of responding to it. They did not deny reality. They negotiated with it. Overconfidence is not arrogance in the loud sense. It is quiet. It feels calm. It feels measured. It manifests as an internal narrative that says, "I've seen this before," or "I understand what's happening," or "I'll know when it's time to act." Intelligence feeds this narrative because it supplies explanations faster than reality can correct them. Every warning sign can be rationalized. Every uncomfortable signal can be contextualized. Instead of prompting action or restraint, intelligence creates justification. This is why intelligence does not create immunity. It creates delay. The delay is subtle but lethal. Smart people tend to believe they can afford more time to analyze, more time to wait for confirmation, more time to let the situation develop. This belief is seductive because it feels disciplined. But often, it is simply ego-resisting uncertainty. The mind does not want to accept that understanding does not equal control. In markets, this dynamic becomes amplified. Intelligent participants often enter with an advantage. They study frameworks, read extensively, and understand narratives early. This early success reinforces the belief that their approach works. Confidence increases. Risk tolerance expands. What began as cautious intelligence slowly becomes intellectual entitlement. The belief shifts from "I understand this better than most" to "I will recognize danger before it matters." But markets do not announce danger clearly. They whisper it. They distort it. They disguise it as opportunity. And intelligence, instead of protecting against this, often makes the whisper easier to ignore. Smart people are especially vulnerable to confirmation bias because they are skilled at finding evidence that supports their position. They can build convincing arguments for staying exposed, even when emotional signals suggest restraint. Overconfidence also changes how losses are perceived. For someone without strong intellectual attachment, a loss is information. For a smart person, a loss is a contradiction. It challenges identity. Instead of responding by reducing exposure or reassessing assumptions, the intelligent mind often seeks to defend its original logic. The loss is reframed as temporary, misunderstood, or externally caused. Holding on begins to feel like patience rather than stubbornness. This pattern is deeply human. It is not a flaw of intelligence itself, but of how intelligence interacts with ego. The more effort someone has invested in understanding a system, the harder it becomes to accept uncertainty within it. Letting go feels like admitting that all that effort did not guarantee safety. That is psychologically uncomfortable, so the mind chooses confidence over humility. In historical power structures, this same mechanism sustained failing regimes long after cracks were visible. Leaders surrounded themselves with advisors who shared similar intellectual frameworks. Dissenting voices were dismissed not because they lacked merit, but because they disrupted certainty. Intelligence created echo chambers. Within those chambers, confidence grew stronger as reality drifted further away. Modern financial systems replicate this dynamic digitally. Smart participants cluster around narratives that validate their understanding. Information circulates rapidly, but interpretation becomes narrow. When everyone in the room is intelligent, doubt feels unnecessary. The system rewards articulation, not restraint. The person who sounds the most certain often gains the most influence, even if certainty itself is the risk. True immunity does not come from intelligence. It comes from self-awareness, from the ability to recognize when confidence is no longer grounded in reality but in identity, from the willingness to act as if one might be wrong, even when evidence seems to support being right. This is rare because it requires separating understanding from ego. The most resilient individuals throughout history were not those who knew the most, but those who respected uncertainty. They treated intelligence as a tool, not a shield. They understood that every system contains variables beyond comprehension. Their confidence was quiet because it was provisional. It could be withdrawn without shame. When intelligence is paired with humility, it becomes powerful. When it is paired with certainty, it becomes dangerous. Loss does not come from lacking intelligence. It comes from believing intelligence has eliminated risk. That belief blinds the mind at the exact moment clarity is most needed. Markets are often described as rational systems. Equations, models, indicators, and theories are used to suggest that price movement is a reflection of logic and efficiency. This belief is comforting, especially to intelligent participants. It implies that if one studies hard enough, understands enough variables, and applies the right framework, outcomes can be anticipated or managed. But history, both ancient and modern, exposes a different reality. Markets are not driven primarily by logic. They are driven by human behavior. Human behavior is not linear. It is emotional, contextual, and reactive. It shifts with perception, not facts. Throughout history, societies collapsed, wars began, and empires expanded not because logic demanded it, but because fear, ambition, loyalty, and narrative overwhelmed rational assessment. The same forces operate inside markets, only faster and with greater amplification. Logic exists in markets, but it does not dominate them. Logic explains after the fact. Behavior moves first. Prices respond to collective emotion long before they respond to information. By the time logic appears visible on charts or reports, behavior has already done its work. This delay creates the illusion that logic caused the movement, when in reality it merely described it. Fear is the most powerful behavioral force in markets. It compresses time. Under fear, future consequences collapse into the present. Decisions that would normally take weeks are made in minutes. Logic does not disappear under fear, but it becomes selective. The mind prioritizes survival over optimization. Even highly intelligent individuals become risk-averse in ways that contradict their long-term goals. This is why markets overshoot on the downside. Fear does not aim for accuracy. It aims for relief. Greed operates differently. It expands time. It makes the future feel close and certain. Greed convinces people that current conditions will persist. Logic again becomes selective. Risks are acknowledged but discounted. Intelligent participants often rationalize greed by framing it as conviction. They tell themselves they are acting on long-term insight, when in reality they are responding to emotional momentum. These cycles repeat because human psychology has not changed. Technology accelerates them, but it does not alter their structure. In ancient markets, fear traveled slowly. In modern markets, it travels instantly. The emotional mechanism, however, remains identical. This is why historical analysis remains relevant to contemporary finance. Human behavior is the constant variable. Authority plays a central role in shaping market behavior. People do not evaluate information in isolation. They interpret it through perceived credibility. In history, authority figures shaped public behavior through speech, symbolism, and ritual. In markets, authority is expressed through confidence, articulation, and visibility. When authoritative voices express certainty, behavior follows, even if the logic is incomplete. Intelligent participants often underestimate the power of authority. They believe their own analysis is independent, but no analysis occurs in a vacuum. Narratives influence which data is noticed, which risks are ignored, and which outcomes feel plausible. Authority shapes perception long before logic evaluates evidence. This is why markets can move dramatically without any fundamental change. Perception changed first. Scarcity intensifies behavioral distortion. When something feels limited, time pressure increases. Logic is replaced by urgency. Scarcity creates competition, and competition activates social comparison. Intelligent individuals, who often pride themselves on independence, become acutely sensitive to being left behind. This fear is rarely acknowledged consciously. It is reframed as strategic positioning or opportunity cost. Behavior, again, precedes logic. Loyalty further complicates rational decision-making. In historical power systems, loyalty ensured stability but also suppressed dissent. Advisors who questioned leadership risked exclusion. In markets, loyalty manifests as attachment to narratives, communities, or positions. Once loyalty forms, logic becomes constrained. Evidence that contradicts the group narrative is discounted. This is not stupidity. It is social survival. Modern markets amplify these dynamics through constant feedback loops. Price movement validates belief. Belief reinforces behavior. Belief reinforces behavior. Logic struggles to interrupt this loop because it requires time and distance, both of which are scarce in emotionally charged environments. Intelligent participants often mistake speed for efficiency. In reality, speed magnifies behavioral error. Information overload worsens the problem. More data does not produce better decisions. It produces stronger justifications. Intelligent minds are particularly vulnerable because they can construct sophisticated explanations for emotionally driven choices. Logic becomes a servant to behavior rather than a guide. The individual feels rational while acting emotionally. The belief that markets should behave logically creates frustration when they do not. This frustration leads to increased activity, more analysis, more adjustments, more engagement. Each action is framed as rational response, but collectively they reflect emotional turbulence. Those who understand that markets move through behavior rather than logic are less reactive. They do not expect fairness or consistency. They expect human response. This understanding does not provide predictive power. It provides psychological stability. Recognizing that markets reflect emotion allows individuals to detach from the need to explain every movement. They stop asking why and start observing how. They accept uncertainty as structural, not temporary. Throughout history, those who maintained power longest were those who understood human behavior better than rules. They did not expect people to act logically under pressure. They anticipated fear, ambition, and loyalty, and designed systems around them. Markets operate the same way. They are not puzzles to be solved, but environments to be navigated. When logic is treated as dominant, disappointment is inevitable. When behavior is treated as foundational, volatility becomes understandable. This shift does not eliminate risk. It reframes it. Risk is no longer an anomaly. It is the natural consequence of human interaction under uncertainty. Understanding that markets move through human behavior rather than logic is not cynical. It is realistic. It aligns expectations with reality. It reduces the emotional shock that causes poor decisions. It reminds the intelligent mind that intelligence is not superior to human nature. It is subject to it. Authority and narrative control are among the most underestimated forces in both historical power systems and modern financial markets. Intelligent people often assume that access to information protects them from manipulation. History repeatedly proves the opposite. The more complex a system becomes, the more people rely on authority to interpret it for them. Complexity does not reduce dependence, it increases it. Throughout history, power was rarely maintained through force alone. It was sustained through narrative. Kings, emperors, religious leaders, and political elites understood that people do not follow facts. They follow meaning. Authority figures framed reality in ways that aligned fear, hope, and identity with their objectives. Once a narrative took hold, logic became secondary. People defended the story even when evidence contradicted it, because abandoning the narrative meant psychological instability. Markets function in a remarkably similar way. Financial systems are complex by design. Most participants cannot fully understand every variable at play. This creates an environment where interpretation becomes more valuable than information itself. Authority emerges not from accuracy, but from confidence, repetition, and visibility. Those who speak clearly and decisively are perceived as knowledgeable, regardless of whether their conclusions are correct. Intelligent individuals are particularly vulnerable to this dynamic because they underestimate its influence on themselves. They believe authority affects others, not them. Yet authority does not bypass intelligence. It exploits it. Intelligent minds seek coherence. They want explanations that fit together. When an authoritative narrative offers a clean, structured interpretation of a chaotic system, it feels relieving. The mind accepts it not because it is proven, but because it reduces uncertainty. Narratives simplify complexity by creating heroes, villains, inevitabilities, and moral arcs. In history, wars were justified as destiny. Economic policies were framed as necessity. Loyalty was presented as virtue. In markets, narratives take similar forms. Certain actors are framed as visionaries, others as manipulators. Certain outcomes are portrayed as inevitable. These stories reduce cognitive load, allowing participants to act decisively without fully understanding the system. Once a narrative is accepted, confirmation bias takes over. Information is no longer evaluated neutrally. It is filtered through the story. Data that supports the narrative is amplified. Data that contradicts it is dismissed as noise, manipulation, or temporary distortion. This process is not conscious, it feels rational. The individual believes they are thinking critically, when in reality they are defending a framework they have already emotionally committed to. Authority strengthens this effect by providing social validation. When respected voices repeat the same narrative, dissent feels risky. In historical power structures, dissent threatens survival. In markets, dissent threatens identity. No one wants to be the person who didn't get it. Intelligent individuals, who often define themselves by their understanding, are especially sensitive to this pressure. Disagreeing with authority feels like admitting ignorance. This is how groupthink forms among highly educated participants. The illusion of independent analysis masks a shared dependence on the same authoritative sources. Everyone believes they arrived at their conclusions independently, while consuming identical narratives framed by the same voices. The result is synchronized behavior that feels rational but is emotionally coordinated. Scarcity intensifies narrative power. When opportunities are framed as limited, authority becomes even more persuasive. Urgency reduces skepticism. The mind shifts from evaluation to action. Historical leaders understood this well. Crises were often exaggerated or accelerated to consolidate control. In markets, urgency is created through timing narratives, cycles, and moments that must not be missed. Logic again steps aside to accommodate pressure. Modern technology amplifies authority and narrative influence at unprecedented speed. Information spreads instantly, but interpretation spreads faster. Social proof reinforces perceived credibility. Visibility is mistaken for legitimacy. The more a narrative is repeated, the more familiar it feels. Familiarity is mistaken for truth. This psychological shortcut operates even in highly intelligent minds. Another critical factor is identity attachment. Once a person publicly aligns with a narrative, disengaging becomes difficult. Changing one's mind feels like a loss of status. In historical courts, changing allegiance could be fatal. In markets, it can be socially humiliating. Intelligent individuals often double down rather than reassess, not because they lack information, but because they seek consistency. Authority-driven narratives also exploit moral framing. Certain positions are portrayed as enlightened, progressive, or inevitable. Opposing views are framed as outdated or fearful. This moral overlay discourages critical analysis. People want to see themselves as rational and forward-thinking. Aligning with the dominant narrative satisfies that self-image. This is where manipulation becomes subtle and effective. No force is required, no deception is obvious. The system operates through psychological incentives. Individuals feel autonomous while being guided. They believe they are choosing freely while responding predictably to narrative cues. This is not conspiracy, it is human behavior. Understanding this dynamic does not mean rejecting all authority or narratives. That would be impractical. It means recognizing their influence. Power lies in awareness, not opposition. Those who understand narrative mechanics can observe without immediate participation. They can separate confidence from competence. They can tolerate uncertainty without rushing toward explanation. Historically, the most enduring strategists were those who maintained distance from dominant narratives. They listened, observed, and waited. They understood that authority cycles change, but human behavior does not. They did not need to be early or loud. They needed to be controlled. In modern finance and crypto markets, this translates to psychological discipline rather than informational advantage. The ability to pause while others react, to question certainty when it feels most convincing, to recognize when logic is being recruited to justify emotion rather than guide decision-making. Think about that for a moment. Authority and narrative will always exist in complex systems. They are not flaws, they are features of human coordination. The danger lies not in their presence, but in unconscious submission to them. Intelligent people do not lose because they lack intelligence. They lose because intelligence gives them better tools to rationalize surrender. True control begins with recognizing when your thoughts are being shaped rather than formed, when certainty feels comforting rather than earned, when belonging feels safer than doubt. Power has always flowed to those who understand this distinction. This is not about prediction or advantage. It is about psychological positioning, remaining grounded while narratives rise and fall, understanding that markets, like empires, move through belief before they move through numbers. And that belief is the most powerful currency of all. Fear and greed are not opposites. They are the same impulse expressed under different conditions. Both arise from uncertainty, and both distort judgment in predictable ways. Intelligent individuals often believe they are immune to these forces because they can articulate logical reasons for their decisions. In reality, logic frequently arrives after emotion, not before it. Historically, rulers understood that fear and reward were interchangeable levers. When loyalty could not be enforced through fear, it was purchased through reward. When reward became unsustainable, fear was reintroduced. The population's behavior changed, but the underlying psychology remained constant. People responded not to facts, but to perceived survival and status threats. In financial systems, fear and greed operate in cycles that mirror this historical pattern. When conditions feel stable and opportunity appears abundant, greed dominates. Individuals overestimate their understanding and underestimate risk. Confidence rises not because the system is safer, but because recent outcomes have been favorable. The mind mistakes recent success for skill. This is when intelligent people become most vulnerable, because confidence suppresses caution. Greed rarely feels like greed internally. It feels like optimization. It feels like efficiency. It feels like recognizing opportunity before others do. Intelligent individuals frame their desire for gain as rational positioning. They build narratives around data points, trends, and frameworks that support action. What they are often responding to, however, is social comparison and anticipated regret. The fear of missing out is still fear, even when it is masked as ambition. As cycles turn, uncertainty increases. Signals become noisier. Outcomes become less predictable. This is where fear resurfaces, but again, it does not announce itself honestly. Fear presents itself as risk management, as prudence, as waiting for confirmation. Intelligent individuals convince themselves they are being cautious, when in reality they are seeking emotional safety. They delay decisions not because they lack information, but because they want certainty in an environment that cannot provide it. This oscillation between greed and fear creates a psychological trap. Action is taken when confidence is artificially high, and restraint is exercised when opportunity is misunderstood as danger. The timing feels rational from the inside, but appears inverted from the outside. This is not a failure of intelligence, it is a failure of emotional calibration. Historical examples reveal the same pattern. Empires expanded aggressively after periods of success, overextending resources and authority. When resistance emerged, leaders became cautious, defensive, and reactive. By the time restraint felt justified, momentum had already shifted. The cycle was not driven by strategy alone, but by collective emotion disguised as judgment. In modern markets, particularly complex ones, feedback loops amplify these emotions. Price movement becomes a proxy for validation. Rising participation reinforces confidence. Declining participation reinforces fear. Individuals read the crowd's behavior as information rather than emotion. Intelligent participants who pride themselves on analysis often forget that crowds are not analytical entities. They are emotional systems responding to shared stimuli. Another layer of distortion comes from loss aversion. Psychologically, losses carry more weight than gains of equal size. This bias affects everyone, regardless of intelligence. Once a loss is experienced or anticipated, decision-making becomes defensive. The goal shifts from optimizing outcomes to avoiding pain. This leads to premature exits, hesitation, or paralysis. Logic is again recruited, but only to justify avoidance. Greed, on the other hand, narrows focus. When the potential for gain feels vivid, peripheral risks fade from attention. The mind selectively attends to information that supports continuation. Warning signs are reframed as temporary or irrelevant. This is why bubbles form without requiring widespread stupidity. They form because emotional alignment overrides critical distance. Intelligent individuals are particularly adept at storytelling. They can construct coherent explanations that make emotionally driven decisions feel principled. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. The better one is at reasoning, the easier it becomes to rationalize bias. Self-awareness declines precisely when confidence peaks. Control systems, both historical and modern, exploit this dynamic. By shaping perception of risk and reward, they guide behavior without overt coercion. In ancient societies, scarcity and abundance were manipulated to maintain order. In markets, narratives, timing, and information asymmetry serve similar functions. Participants believe they are reacting to reality when they are often reacting to engineered signals. Patience is the psychological counterweight to fear and greed, but it is rarely understood correctly. Patience is not inaction, it is emotional regulation. It is the ability to tolerate ambiguity without forcing resolution. Historically, the most effective strategists were those who could endure uncertainty longer than their opponents. They waited not because they were passive, but because they understood that emotional exhaustion precedes strategic error. In financial behavior, patience requires resisting the urge to align decisions with emotional peaks. It means recognizing when urgency is externally induced rather than internally justified. This is exceptionally difficult in environments that reward constant engagement. Silence feels like loss. Stillness feels like irrelevance. Intelligent individuals often struggle here because their identity is tied to activity and understanding. Fear and greed also interact with identity and ego. Success reinforces self-image. Failure threatens it. Decisions become less about outcomes and more about preserving a sense of competence. This leads to defensive reasoning, selective memory, and resistance to reassessment. The mind protects itself first, accuracy second. Think about that for a moment. The goal is not to eliminate emotion. That is impossible. The goal is to recognize emotional states before they dictate behavior. To notice when confidence feels euphoric rather than grounded, when caution feels heavy rather than clear. These sensations are signals, not commands. Historically, power accumulated to those who mastered themselves before attempting to master systems. They understood that reacting emotionally made them predictable. Predictability invites exploitation. Control begins with internal discipline. In modern markets, the same principle applies. Those who understand fear and greed as internal cycles rather than external truths gain psychological distance. They are less compelled to act at emotional extremes. They observe patterns without becoming absorbed by them. This is not about avoiding loss or maximizing gain. It is about maintaining agency, about making decisions from a position of stability rather than urgency, about understanding that the greatest risk is not uncertainty, but unconscious participation in emotional cycles that repeat endlessly. Fear and greed will continue to drive collective behavior. They always have. The difference between those who endure and those who are consumed lies not in intelligence, but in emotional awareness. Power in its most durable form begins there. Information asymmetry is not a flaw in systems. It is the foundation on which power is built. Throughout history, those who controlled the flow of information controlled outcomes, not because they predicted the future, but because they shaped perception in the present. The imbalance between what is known, what is believed, and what is withheld creates behavioral leverage. In ancient courts, rulers rarely revealed their full intentions. Decisions were announced only after outcomes were secured. Advisors were given partial truths. Rivals were fed uncertainty. This was not secrecy for its own sake, but strategy. When others lack clarity, they hesitate. When they hesitate, they act late. Acting late is often worse than acting wrong. Control emerges not from superior strength, but from superior timing enabled by superior information. Modern financial systems operate on the same principle, but with far greater scale and speed. Information moves constantly, yet understanding remains uneven. Data is abundant, but meaning is scarce. This creates the illusion of transparency while preserving asymmetry. Intelligent individuals often mistake access to information for quality of insight. In reality, access does not remove imbalance, it often amplifies it. Those with structural advantage do not need perfect foresight. They need patience and positioning. By the time information reaches the broader public, its utility has usually decayed. What remains is interpretation, speculation, and emotional reaction. This is where behavior becomes predictable. Predictability is exploitable. Crowds respond to signals, not systems. A headline, a narrative shift. A sudden movement creates urgency. Intelligent participants analyze the signal itself, but often fail to ask why it appeared when it did. Information timing is rarely accidental. When information arrives suddenly, it often serves someone's exit, not someone's entry. Another layer of asymmetry exists in emotional distance. Those closest to systems are rarely emotionally invested in outcomes the way outsiders are. Emotional attachment reduces objectivity. Detachment preserves optionality. Historically, elites maintained power by separating themselves from consequences experienced by the masses. This allowed clearer decision-making. In markets, a similar separation exists between those who can absorb volatility and those for whom volatility feels existential. Intelligent individuals often underestimate this difference. They assume shared incentives. They assume similar time horizons. They assume rational alignment. These assumptions collapse under stress. When pressure increases, incentives diverge. Those with flexibility wait. Those without it rush. The system rewards waiting. Whale versus retail dynamics are not about intelligence gaps. They are about structural position. Size creates optionality. Optionality creates patience. Patience creates advantage. Smaller participants, regardless of intellect, feel urgency sooner. Urgency compresses time horizons. Compressed horizons force suboptimal decisions. This is not a moral failing, it is a psychological inevitability. Control systems thrive on this inevitability. They do not need to manipulate everyone. They need only to shape the environment so that predictable behavior emerges. Noise increases, signals blur, narratives conflict. Individuals seek certainty and attach to whichever explanation reduces discomfort. This attachment feels like conviction, but is often relief. Historically, propaganda worked not by convincing everyone, but by exhausting them. When too many versions of truth exist, people stop questioning and start aligning emotionally. In financial environments, constant commentary serves a similar function. The mind becomes saturated. Decision fatigue sets in. Simplistic narratives become attractive. Intelligent individuals are not immune. In fact, they may be more vulnerable because they consume more information, increasing cognitive load. Another critical asymmetry lies in consequences. Those with power can be wrong repeatedly without immediate penalty. Their survival does not depend on single decisions. This allows experimentation, patience, and recovery. Those without power face asymmetric risk. A few errors can eliminate participation entirely. This pressure alters psychology. It increases loss aversion. It narrows focus. It reduces strategic flexibility. Understanding this dynamic reframes behavior. What appears irrational from the outside often makes sense within constrained conditions. Panic is not stupidity. It is adaptation to perceived threat. The system does not punish ignorance alone. It punishes fragility. Modern markets reward those who understand that narratives are tools, not truths. Narratives mobilize behavior. They create momentum. They justify outcomes after the fact. Intelligent individuals often try to evaluate narratives for accuracy when the more useful question is influence. Who benefits if this story spreads? Who loses if it does not? Information asymmetry also interacts with ego. Being early feels intelligent. Being late feels foolish. This emotional framing distorts analysis. Individuals rush to avoid social and internal judgment. Decisions become identity protective rather than outcome focused. The need to feel informed overrides the need to be correct. Historically, the most effective power holders cultivated ambiguity around themselves. They allowed others to project meaning. This reduced resistance and increased compliance. In markets, ambiguity functions similarly. Unclear signals allow different groups to interpret in ways that suit their psychology. Action follows interpretation, not reality. The discipline required to navigate this environment is not superior analysis, but superior restraint. It is the ability to observe without immediate alignment, to tolerate not knowing, to resist the pressure to convert information into action prematurely. This restraint is rare because it conflicts with human desire for resolution. Think about that for a moment. Power accumulates to those who move after others exhaust themselves reacting. This has been true in empires, wars, and financial systems. Reaction consumes energy. Observation conserves it. Those who conserve energy gain leverage over time. Understanding information asymmetry does not grant immunity. It grants awareness. Awareness creates distance. Distance creates choice. Choice, agency. The goal is not to outsmart systems, but to avoid being unconsciously shaped by them. In the end, losing is often less about being wrong and more about being early, emotional, and exposed to consequences without buffers. Intelligent individuals struggle not because they lack understanding, but because they underestimate the psychological weight of asymmetry. Mastery begins with recognizing where you stand in the structure, not where you wish you stood. Control begins with aligning behavior to reality rather than narrative. Those who do this consistently are not louder, faster, or more confident. They are quieter, slower, and far more difficult to influence. Ladies and gentlemen, power does not announce itself with noise. It reveals itself in patterns. Across history, across markets, across every system built by humans, The same truth repeats quietly. Outcomes are rarely decided by intelligence alone. They are decided by behavior, under pressure. Smart people do not lose because they lack knowledge. They lose because knowledge does not cancel fear. It does not dissolve ego. It does not neutralize urgency. Intelligence often sharpens these forces instead of weakening them. The mind begins to justify emotion with logic. Stories replace discipline. Conviction replaces patience. History shows us this again and again. Empires did not fall because leaders were ignorant. They fell because leaders believed they were immune to human weakness. Markets operate the same way. The structure changes. The instruments change. Human psychology does not. Control systems do not need to deceive you. They only need you to react. Every reaction transfers power away from you. Every emotional decision shortens your time horizon. Every rushed move hands advantage to someone who is willing to wait. The real divide is not between smart and foolish. It is between those who act to relieve discomfort and those who can sit inside it, between those who need certainty and those who can operate without it, between those chasing outcomes and those studying behavior. Understanding this does not mean withdrawing from systems. It means seeing them clearly. It means recognizing when you are being pulled by fear, status, or urgency rather than reason. It means choosing observation over participation when participation offers no edge. Markets, like history, reward restraint more than brilliance. They reward emotional control more than prediction. They reward patience more than confidence. Those who survive long enough eventually see this. Those who don't never get the chance. If this way of thinking resonates, if you want to understand power rather than chase it, manipulation rather than fall for it, psychology rather than noise, then stay here. Subscribe not for signals, not for hype, not for promises, but for clarity. Because the most dangerous place to stand is inside a system you don't understand. This is Power Ledger.